Hey, you. Yeah, you. What gives you the right to make your own choices? No, seriously, what gives you the right? I want to try to answer that question today because it's a question that is newly live in our public discourse. Your right to make your own choices is under threat. Our president effectively said that when he announced his vaccine mandate. He said this is not about personal liberty, not about personal freedom. And we've kind of lost the thread a little bit when it comes to this great Western tradition, this idea that, you have the right to choose for yourself, to rule yourself, to self-govern, and that people together in groups and especially in nations have the right to self-govern, to elect their own representatives and to govern themselves locally insofar as possible. All of these things are deeply, deeply rooted in a long history of Western thought. And because we've lost our grasp on that history, we've kind of lost our grasp on the very idea that we should be free. People sometimes talk about this as if it only ever came into being like magically during the Protestant Reformation or during the Enlightenment, right? Liberalism suddenly occurred, and then people suddenly had the idea that, maybe people should be allowed to choose for themselves. And it's true that this idea developed over time, but it's not true at all that it's some kind of like bolt from the blue that only occurred like at the founding of America or, when Luther nailed his theses to the door. In fact, it's one of the oldest and deepest developments in Western thought, and it incorporates the two pillars of the West that we talk about on this show. It's one of the ideas of the West that comes most fully from both Athens and Jerusalem. It's like a meeting of classical pagan Greek and Roman philosophy with Judeo-Christian theology. So I want to tell you a little bit of that story today so that you can have a deeper, firmer grasp on why it is you have the right to make your own choices. And then I'm going to answer a mailbag question that has to do with the vaccine mandate. So let's begin at the beginning. But first, my producers had worked out an agreement with Paint Your Life to send me a painting of a picture that I don't know what this is. So I'm going to unbox it now on camera and show you what they have done. I have no idea what is in this box. Oh my gosh. Okay, so this is incredible. Wow, that is really well done. This is my cat, Chad Cat, when he was a baby, like a little kitten right after we adopted him. And y'all know that I love my cat. I'm totally hanging it. Oh my gosh. Chad Cat's like incredibly adorable. I know everybody thinks their cat is the most adorable, but my cat is the most adorable cat. And the guys at Paint Your Life did a really, really beautiful job with this. I am totally gonna hold on to this forever. This is awesome. So if you want something like this, if you want a hand-painted version of a cherished photo or cherished memory, text Heretics, Heretics, to 64,000. There's no risk. If you don't love the final result, your money is refunded, but you're gonna love it. I mean, that was awesome. It's guaranteed. Terms apply, available at paintyourlife.com/terms. You get 20% off. Text Heretics to 64,000 to get your own handmade custom painting. So last week, when we talked about St. Thomas More and his execution, and before that, his defiance of Henry VIII, his refusal to sign the oath of succession and of supremacy, I mentioned something kind of weird, which is that when More went up against the church authorities, the Church of England authorities at Lambeth Palace, he said some things that kind of sounded like Luther. Martin Luther, obviously famous initiator of the Protestant Reformation, more famous opponent of the Protestant Reformation. But when Luther went up against the Diet of Worms, which we're going to talk about in a bit, when he was effectively condemned as a heretic, he said some very famous things about his conscience, right? That here I stand, I can do no other, right? In my conscience, with the backing of scripture and of reason, I cannot back down from my principle. More said something quite similar. He said that I have this backing of all the congregation of saints, right? The communion of saints and the church stands behind me, even as I stand alone against these authorities against Henry VIII. I appeal to my conscience, right? I have my conscience to kind of guide me in this. And so in some sense, this is an idea that was working itself out in Europe, even across the divides that seemed to split people apart at the time. This idea of your conscience, that you have a voice in your head, basically, which tells you the truth about moral questions, no matter what other earthly or worldly powers are coming down on you, right? That idea is really kind of a radical idea in its implications, right? It's radical because of what it did to Europe during the period of the Reformation, but it's radical anytime it comes up, right? Anytime you sort of suggest that the individual human mind and soul has some access to moral truth that power can't threaten, right? That no king or principality or president can come in and take away your conscience, your right to understand God's will for you or the moral truth, right? That's an incredibly profound idea. And as I said, it goes all the way back to really the beginning of Western philosophy, Western thought, Western history. We're going to start with Aristotle. And there's kind of two concepts we have to get a grasp on here. One is conscience, and the other one is this concept from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics called sometimes prudence or practical reason. The Greek word here is phronesis, Phron long E-S-I-S, phronesis. And in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle develops this as kind of the foundation both of personal morality and of politics, because he thinks those things are very, very closely linked. Your phronesis is the virtue that enables you to take your big ideals, your abstract principles, like, say, thou shalt not kill, or, don't steal, and apply them in the moment when the complications and the messiness of life are there. And, well, maybe thou shalt not steal, but maybe there's a person that you love who has gone insane and they have possession of a weapon and you have to take it away from them, right? How do you sort of navigate those conflicts and balance them? Well, phronesis is the virtue of doing that. And that's why we call it prudence, right? When Donald Trump was running in 2016 and there were these kind of purists, these moral purists who couldn't possibly sully themselves by voting for such, an unpleasant man, there were people on the right, including, many of my friends and colleagues who were saying, no, this is a matter of prudence because the situation is not just, oh, who do I vote for in the abstract? The situation is, here's this binary choice between Trump and Clinton, right? That was an act of phronesis. It was saying, yes, there are these principles at stake, but there are also these facts on the ground. And how do we bring those principles down onto the ground and live them out in real time? So Aristotle has some brilliant things to say about this, which kind of will lay the groundwork for a lot of what we're going to talk about. Here's the Nicomachean Ethics, Book 6, Chapter 5. So Aristotle is introducing this idea here and trying to get a handle on what it is. He says, although there is a virtue of an art, there is not a virtue of prudence. In the case of an art, it is more choice-worthy for one to err voluntarily, less choice-worthy in the case of prudence, as also in the virtues. It is clear that prudence is a certain virtue and not an art. He's saying prudence is an excellence, an arete. It's a way of being excellent at something. So what are you excellent at if you are prudent, if you have phronesis? He says it is clear prudence is a certain virtue. And since there are two parts of the soul having reason, prudence would be the virtue of one of them, namely the part involved in the formation of opinions. This is very important. We have to get a handle on the Greek in order to understand exactly what he's talking about, because it's profoundly relevant to our culture of, expert worship and public health and political science, right? Aristotle is saying there are two parts of the soul which deal with the intellect. That is, you have two ways of thinking or two capacities for thought. One is for what's called episteme, and that's science. And science is where there are hard and fast rules. So like math, for example, right? 2 + 2 = 4. We grasp that absolutely. There's no question about it. There's no arguing over it. It just is. That's one part of our mind is able to grasp that kind of stuff. Then there's opinion, which is a translation of the word doxa. And that's how things seem to you. How does it look to you on the ground? And Aristotle is saying that's also important information. And you have a legitimate and a natural and a healthy capacity to look around you and see what's going on. Now, there is a virtue in that. That is, you can be really good at that, and you can develop your excellence in just figuring out what the facts on the ground are and how you should act in the context of them. And that virtue is prudence. All of our public health experts, all of our political scientists, all of our Dr. Fauci's who insist, because they have the perfect calculation that's going to predict what's going to happen 10, 20, 30 years down the line, our climate scientists, everybody who tells you that they know what you must do because of their mathematics, have completely left out this central and crucial virtue of prudence, because you are the person on the ground who gets to take the information that experts indeed can give you and marry it with what's around you and what's in your heart and what you're seeing, your intuitions, your gut feelings, your love for the people around you, for your family. Reasoning out of those things is a legitimate way to reason. In fact, it's an essential way to reason if you want to be free. That's prudence. That's phronesis. Let's read a couple other things that Aristotle has to say about it. He says, one sign of what has been said is the fact that the young become skilled in geometry and mathematics and are wise in such things, but a young person does not seem to be prudent. The cause is that prudence is also of particulars, which come to be known as a result of experience. But a young person is inexperienced. A long period of time creates experience. And then someone might examine this as well. On account of what, indeed, might a boy become skilled in mathematics, but not wise or well-versed in nature? Is it because the former subjects exist through abstraction, whereas the principles of the latter come from experience, and the young do not have any settled convictions about these latter, but merely speak of them, whereas with mathematics and geometry, what they are is not unclear? He's making an observation that we can all agree with, which is age brings wisdom with it, right? If you live right, if you pay attention, no matter what your education is, no matter how many, calculus classes you took in high school, older people gain a certain amount of wisdom. That's why we go to them, not just for their stories and their experiences, but for the wisdom that they've drawn out of that experience. So he's saying phronesis is something that you cannot get from a textbook. You can't get it from a mathematical formula. You can't get it from some expert sailing in to tell you how to run your life. It actually exists in the individual person over the course of his life. All right, that's phronesis. Now let's talk about conscience, and then we're going to talk about how conscience and phronesis, that is prudence, are related to one another. But first, you guys, if you haven't already, you have to check out Public Goods. They are your one-stop shop for clean, excellent basics. Anything that you could imagine wanting to have around the house: soap, toilet paper, shampoo, snacks. Everything is affordable, and nothing has any of those gross additives that you find in the grocery store where you can't even pronounce the name of the ingredient. They look great in my kitchen. I use their soap all the time. I constantly just chow down on their chocolate-covered almonds. My cat, Chad Cat, is obsessed with the freeze-dried duck nibs, and I'm obsessed with saying freeze-dried duck nibs. Say that 5 times fast if you can. What you can do right now is get $15 of Public Goods stuff for free. There's no minimum purchase. It's an incredible deal. Go to publicgoods.com/heretics or use the code heretics at checkout. That's publicgoods.com/heretics, and you will get $15 off your first order. That is $15 of free stuff. You could order $15 worth of freeze-dried duck nibs if you want, or any kind of basics, all for free. publicgoods.com/heretics. Okay, back to the show. So in order for phronesis, that is prudence and your ability to see what's around you, to make your own decisions on the basis of what you know to be true, right? In order for that to work, you need to have a voice in your head that is telling you the truth, that you can hear. This is basically the idea of conscience. Conscience is a word that comes down to us from Greek through Latin. The Latin root is conscio. That is, scio is I know, and con is with. To conscio is to know something with yourself. It's kind of like the thing that you know internally that you can't help seeing about yourself. The Greek version of this is suneidesis, and it's basically the same root. It's the thing that just lives in your mind, and you kind of can't help it. In fact, a lot of people would like to be able to help it, but you can't get away from your conscience. So this is the kind of original root of where this idea comes from, and you get it all over Greek literature, this idea that we've talked about before in like plays and tragedies. We talked about it with Macbeth, right? That the moral universe kind of hounds you, follows you around, pronounces judgment upon your actions. And it's kind of weird when you think about it, right? That you have at least two selves in your head in some way, right? You have the person that does the action, and then the person that observes the action and even not just sees it, but sees it as good or bad, right? This is the essence of what's called self-awareness. And it's one of the deepest mysteries of human philosophy, human existence, right? The reason why the word consciousness, that is being conscious, is so closely related to conscience is because both of them are the experience of not just going about unreflectively in the world, but actually observing yourself as you do. And one of the weirdest things that was inherent in Greek wisdom and observation and is true is that your observation of yourself doesn't come in a morally neutral way. It carries judgment with it. I'm going to read a passage in a kind of obscure book by our old pal, C.S. Lewis. Lewis, in his abundant free time, I guess, while he was writing, some of the great works of theology and philosophy of his day and ever, had this hobby where he would trace the etymologies of words and learn what he could from them. And so he wrote a little essay in a book called Studies in Words, came out in 1960. And this little essay is about conscience, right, and the development of this idea. So I'm going to read some of his kind of citations because he gives you a range of the idea of how this works in Greek. He says, linguistically, the construction which represents this experience in the simplest form is I conspire this or that to myself. He's made up this verb, right? Conspire is the act of having a conscience or of observing yourself, right? So I'm kind of aware of this or that thing to myself. So in Aristophanes, Aristophanes played the Thesmophorias Deucai. Aristophanes, xunoida, that is, I conspire many dreadful deeds to myself. I know a lot against myself. And he goes on to cite all these other examples, right? In Euripides' Orestes, right? Menelaus asks Orestes, the haunted matricide, what is your malady? What is your illness? And Orestes replies, sunesis, the awareness, the knowledge of my deed, right? This thing that haunts you, which you can't escape because it is you, is in some sense the root of your conscience. Very, very weird that we do this and suggestive of something, right? The fact that we can't help it, the fact that it's built into our way of thinking means it must be there for something, even though it's hugely unpleasant. There are a bunch of quotes here in this Lewis essay especially from Latin, about how awful it is to have a bad conscience or to have a good conscience, right? In Latin, says Lewis, when what you conspire to yourself, what you are aware of to yourself is good, or at least there's nothing bad, then you have a good conscientia. All wish to hide their sins, says Seneca, but a good conscientia loves the light. This is a universal human experience. It takes form in this word, which we now sort of take from Latin and Greek, and it's the way we can trust our phronesis. The fact that we have this kind of inescapable conscience, the fact that our conscience actually doesn't abandon us even when we wish it would, right, gives us the power, if we choose, to make good moral decisions. Now, it doesn't mean that you can just reason in the abstract about those moral decisions. It doesn't mean you don't need information from people who know more than you about stuff. You absolutely do, right? But at the end of the day, Dr. Fauci doesn't know what's good for your family. You do. And you have the right to make that decision and even to make mistakes because of the sanctity of your conscience, because the only thing it can possibly be, right, is a link to a moral law that lives outside of you. That's the next part we're going to get into, because this Greek idea then makes its way crucially into the Bible through St. Paul. St. Paul loves to talk about conscience. So let's read one of his most famous ideas about conscience from the letter to the Romans. This is, in some sense, this is Paul's magnum opus. And he goes on and on about suneidesis, and connects it to divinity, but not in the sense of, just even, only Christians or only Jews have this connection to divinity. But he says this is in some way, even pagans, even Gentiles can access this thing. Here's Romans chapter 2. Paul writes, when Gentiles, that is non-Jews, when Gentiles who do not have the law, do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them, and at other times even defending them. The natural metaphor here is often that of the law court, right? You have an internal law court that accuses you of wrongdoing and applauds you. You know when you've done something right. So an example of this, of course, is thou shalt not kill, right? And we saw that play out in Macbeth, how he had this internal law court that even though he tried to just deny the very existence of meaning, the very existence of the moral universe, followed him, ate him alive, right? Turned him into a monster. This is what happens if you kind of shove your conscience aside. Paul is saying that some of those laws, right, the laws that are in the Torah, not all of them, obviously, but some of those laws come to you, are accessible to you in your conscience. They're kind of written onto your heart. The history of moral reasoning in the Christian church is, in some sense, a history of working out the implications of this idea. What does it mean that although God chose to reveal his law to a particular people, that law also corresponded to moral intuitions, to conscience in the hearts of every man, right? What does it mean? And what does that faculty do for us? And basically the rest of the church thought on this subject is just the attempt to kind of unify this idea of divine conscience with phronesis and practical wisdom. So we're going to get to that next. You guys know that I am like a little bit obsessed with lifting weights, and this company, Ned, has really been helpful to me with that. When I lift heavy, I sometimes get joint pain, like in my right shoulder or my elbow. They make this CBD ointment that you just, it's topical. So you just put it on where you're experiencing pain, and it's like magic. I mean, it really does help me go harder in the gym. They make a bunch of other stuff too with CBD, which can help with stress, sleep, pain, anxiety, inflammation, all kinds of stuff that you would just encounter in your day-to-day life. Don't be scared off by the CBD stuff. It's all natural, science-backed, and it's not going to get you high, I promise. But it is a really wonderful company that I heartily trust and endorse. I use their stuff quite a bit. They are completely transparent. They share third-party lab reports, so you can go check that out. And if you want to try their new de-stress blend, you can go to helloned.com/heretics or enter heretics at checkout, and you'll get a free sample of the de-stress blend and 15% off every order over $40. So one more time, it's helloned.com/heretics. You get 15% off plus a free sample for anything over $40. So we're getting now to sort of medieval, late antique and medieval church theology and philosophy. And we're on our way to understanding better why both Luther and St. Thomas More thought they could stand on their conscience alone. And then we're going to get from there, right, to why we can stand on our conscience alone when we are thinking about what to do. Ray, the vaccine mandates, Ray, other government overreach, right? Civil disobedience, things of that nature, right? You can see how dangerous this idea is, right? How potentially radical. And the church, in kind of an act of prudence, right, was trying to balance the fact that there are absolute moral laws with the fact that people are broken and oppress one another. And so you need space for the possibility that somebody's inner voice, somebody's conscience is telling him the truth when corrupt people are all telling lies, right? So the kind of like root of this, of this history that I'm going to tell, which eventually goes up to St. Thomas Aquinas, right, begins with St. Jerome. This is 4th, 5th century AD church father. He writes this commentary on Ezekiel, the book of Ezekiel, and he does this allegorical interpretation of this vision of four beasts from the heavens with four faces: a face of a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle. Now, he relates the first three, man, lion, and ox, to Plato's tripartite division of the soul, which we've talked about a little bit, right? Appetites, spirit, or courage, thumos, and reason. So you see already, right, that Jerome is thinking in terms of classical intuition, right? Things that existed in pagan Greece and Rome, but nevertheless, because of this conscience, because you might say of this natural law or of this kind of intuition that exists in all people, right? Jerome thinks that these philosophical ideas also find expression, their highest expression really, in the truths of the Bible. And then he says that this eagle, this fourth vision of the eagle represents a kind of extra added thing on top of Plato's tripartite soul. So he's saying, here's what they add in the Bible, right? That kind of ties all this together and gives us the religious, the Christian version. Jerome writes, now above these three was the eagle. So in the soul, they say, above the other three elements and beyond them is a fourth, which the Greeks call synderesis. This is that spark of conscience, which was not quenched even in the heart of Cain, right? So he's saying, just like Macbeth, right? Cain tried to escape the moral law. It came back to haunt him in the person of the very voice of God, right? So Cain himself also had conscience when he was driven out of paradise. This is that which makes us to feel our sinfulness when we are overcome by evil desire or unbridled spirit or deceived by sham reason. It is natural to identify synderesis with the eagle since it is distinct from the other three elements and corrects them when they err. Now, it's not quite spelled out here, but Jerome is observing a very profound reality that I was mentioning when I linked consciousness and conscience, right? The fact that we say, oh, I'm angry, but I'm not going to hit my wife. Or we say, well, I'm hungry, but I don't want to get fat, so I'm not going to eat. All of the fact that we have these internal debates with ourselves suggests that we have this thing that hovers above all the parts of our soul, even in some sense, our abstract reason. And so this is an incredibly elevated, even divine thing, this kind of spark, which is what Jerome calls it, the scintilla, the spark of conscience, which kind of stands apart from us and judges us, even though it's part of us. And what I'm getting to here, right, is that God's voice, right, the moral law is so close to us. God's relationship with us is so intimate that he actually there's a part of us that is actually speaking in his voice. Now, we're broken, we're fallen, right? And so often we ignore that voice. Sometimes it gets garbled because of our desires and our passions, right? All of these things the church fathers were well aware of, but they're insisting here, right, that this thing that the Greeks had, that they intuited, that they knew about, that the motor, the engine of practical wisdom is actually a part of our soul, which connects us to our lost divine origin, right? To the God who made us. You'll notice that Jerome uses this word synderesis. And basically that seems to have been a mistake. Like a lot of people think he just meant sunadesis. But there then evolves this sort of debate about, well, how are these two things linked? If there's a capacity that kind of stands apart and judges, is that the same thing as conscience, or is conscience another thing? And eventually we develop these two ideas. Synderesis becomes basically practical reason. It's your capacity, your virtue, your excellence at making decisions on the basis of the information around you. And your conscience is then the individual act, right, of judging and doing the thing that you judge to be good. I'm going to read to you now from the master, St. Thomas Aquinas, who kind of reconciles all of these things. Aquinas basically says that the capacity to stand outside of yourself and judge yourself, this virtue, is an inborn habit. Now, remember from Aristotle that habits are things that you have to train usually, right? The virtues, essentially, moral virtues are habits because they have to do with how you react to things, what you love, what you hate, what you avoid, right? Your conscience is a habit. That is, it's a way of behaving and acting that is nevertheless inborn in you. You get born with it. And as we've said, you essentially can't escape it. You can distort it, you can try to drown it out, and yet nevertheless, you have this, you're kind of compelled to this habit. You have it no matter what, right? And he's saying that learning to listen to this habit is so important that even if you get the facts wrong, right? Even if you are deceived about something, by accident, but you have no evil intent, right? And you follow your conscience, you haven't actually sinned. So for example, right, let's say you know that you're not supposed to commit adultery, but you think that another woman is your wife. You mistake her, it's dark, whatever, somebody deceives you. This happens sometimes in Shakespeare, this kind of thing, right? And therefore you sleep with her, right? You're not actually committing a sin in Thomas's view, because following your conscience, right, is inherently actually a virtuous thing. So here's Thomas. This is the first part of the second part of the Summa Theologica. Question 19, Article 6. He says, if reason or conscience err with an error that is voluntary, either directly or through negligence, so that one errs about what one ought to know, then such an error of reason or conscience does not excuse the will that abides by that erring reason or conscience from being evil. But if the error arise from ignorance of some circumstance and without any negligence, so that it cause the act to be involuntary, then that error of reason or conscience excuses the will that abides by that erring reason from being evil. For instance, if erring reason tell a man that he should go to another man's wife, the will that abides by that erring reason is evil, since the error arises from ignorance of the divine law, which he is bound to know. But if a man's reason errs in mistaking another for his wife, and if he wish to give her the right when she asks for it, his will is excused from being evil, because this error arises from ignorance of a circumstance, which ignorance excuses and causes the act to be involuntary. Now, this sounds kind of obscure, but it's very, very important. So I'm going to spend some time on it. It's a kind of radical thing that Aquinas is saying. He's saying, you have a responsibility to maintain and cultivate a healthy conscience so that you know the divine law. Now, this is Aquinas' idea that you have eternal law, right? Which then manifests itself in natural and divine law. The natural law is kind of our connection, our intuition to the law, like Paul was talking about. And divine law is the laws that God actually writes down in the Bible, or God causes others to write down in the Bible. He's saying your conscience is beholden to those things, and you're not allowed to just like feign ignorance of them. You can't just say, "Oh, I thought you were supposed to sleep with another man's wife." Like as a principle, if you think that that's true, then you're to blame. But you may be deceived about the facts on the ground. You may not actually know, for example, that this woman isn't your wife, in which case following your conscience is so important, so essential to the development of your personal soul, that you are actually excused from sin. Aquinas is effectively saying your personal morality and your exercise of choice according to conscience is inextricable from your being good. You can't actually be forced into virtue. You have to make choices, right, which are in accordance with virtue. And that's so important that if your conscience goes, if the facts on the ground are difficult to ascertain, or if you're wrong about them, you still need to act according to your conscience and your best lights. Here's why that's important for us. Every time somebody says, well, I have a right to choose, right, whether to take this vaccine, it stands right within the remit of my personal choice. Or I have a right to educate my children, right, to choose how my children will be educated and to say whether or not they will learn about 57 genders and learn, that America is evil, right? Every time somebody says that, the answer from our progressive bureaucrats is, no, it's just too complicated, and you don't have the expertise to know all of the facts on the ground. Now, if they got those facts right more often, then this might be a bigger concern. But since they themselves constantly flip-flop and get things wrong, right, they're already on shaky ground. But more importantly and more deeply, right, the fact that there may be a lot of information out there, and you may have to use your best judgment, right, about gaining the information that is relevant to you. And you may be, tasked with the responsibility of ascertaining that information as much as possible. Maybe do some research into the vaccine, right? Figure out if it poses a risk to you. Think about whether or not, it would be good to get it, that sort of thing, right? Or, for example, you have a responsibility to know, right, what your children are being taught and whether or not you approve of it. But the fact that you don't have all the information does not absolve you of exercising your conscience, and it does not prohibit you from exercising your conscience, because your conscience is the essence of yourself as a being, as a divinely created being with the right to make your own moral choices. If you snuff that out, if you extinguish it, then what does it matter how good your program is? Like, even let's imagine that you can create some utopian system in which, right, everybody is forced to do the right thing all the time, right? It's actually impossible, but let's imagine it. What's the point? You've completely destroyed the essence of moral choice. And the idea that that was like something that was invented in the Enlightenment is kind of given the lie to by this passage from Aquinas. Aquinas is observing something, I think, quite profound about our fallen state. And I'm going to present this here as a theory, right? Everybody says, that it's weird in the book of Genesis that we get the knowledge of good and evil. We're forbidden from the knowledge of good and evil, and we only get it by disobeying God. Everybody says, what is this knowledge of good and evil? And isn't that a good thing, right? Isn't knowing good and evil a good thing? Well, in some sense, right, it's good to have conscience. It's good to act on your conscience, right? But I sort of suspect that the idea here is in our prelapsarian state, that is before we fell, our will and our reason and our conscience were so unified that we didn't, have to think about or force ourselves to do the right thing. It just happened, right? Our will was directed toward the good, and the will and the good were one. Once you disobey God, right, your will and the good are separate. And so there has to be this kind of intervening thing that comes up called the knowledge of good and evil, a faculty for knowing good and evil. That faculty is conscience, is phronesis, right, is the ability to look around you and make these choices. And the fact that it just doesn't come naturally to us anymore, that's a result of the fall. The knowledge of good and evil isn't evil itself per se. It's the necessity for it that puts us in our fallen state. It's the intervention of thought and knowledge, of having to think about it, right? That separates us from just kind of natural perfection of doing God's will. So yeah, right. Would it be better if we all just kind of spontaneously did what was good and right? Of course it would. But we're not in that position. And so in our fallen state, God has given us or left in us, right? Or perhaps used the consequence of our fallen state to speak to us directly, right? To give us guidance back to him. And unless we can use that guidance, right? Unless we are able to cultivate and practice this inborn habit, we are effectively erased as moral beings. It makes it impossible for us to return to some sort of better version of ourselves. That's why authoritarianism is wrong and evil, right? Not because the things that they want you to do might not be good, right? And plenty of authoritarian, dictatorial decrees prescribe things that I think would be good. Plenty of dictators say things like, look, I think people should get vaccinated. I'm vaccinated, right? But the point is not the outcome. The point is the choice, right? And if you take that choice away from people, you effectively erase their one route back from the fall, which is why it is a satanic thing to do. It is a wall that you erect in between God and humanity, right? And so I cannot condemn it strongly enough, even if the results are good. It doesn't matter how good your formula is. It doesn't matter what results it produces. It does not matter because it destroys the possibility of exercising our knowledge of good and evil in such a way as to someday reach a state where we will no longer need knowledge because we will no longer need to think about it because we will just do what is right and good. Okay, what does all of this have to do with Luther and Thomas More and with us and with our vaccine mandates? Well, let's get to that next. But first, these kinds of interactions that I get to have on locals, like the one that I am about to have with Falderall, where we apply the principles of the West to our lives, to the real choices that face us. This is such a privilege. The Young Heretics community on locals really is an amazing place to be. And it's not just the mailbag. You get episodes a week in advance. You get essays that I write exclusively for locals and all kinds of other stuff, like workout tips and whiskey recommendations and all that. Right now, you can get a free month of locals, a risk-free trial for 1 month if you go to youngheretics.com/locals and enter the code heretics at checkout. That's HERETICS. You get 1 month free when you sign up at youngheretics.com/locals. Totally risk-free. We won't charge if you don't like it. Won't blame you, but I think you will like it, and I would love to see you there. So it's youngheretics.com/locals. Offer code heretics at checkout. Okay, I'm going to read to you now first from Luther's self-defense at what is called the Diet of Worms. This happened in 1521, so shortly before Thomas More was executed. The Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire conducted this diet, this council, during which time Luther was given an opportunity to defend himself, but was eventually declared a heretic. Here's what Luther, a very, very famous passage from Luther's self-defense. He says, "Since your serene majesty and your lordships seek a simple answer, I will give it in this manner, neither horned nor toothed, unless I am convinced by the testimony of the scriptures or by clear reason. For I do not trust either in the Pope or in councils alone, since it is well known that they have often erred and contradicted themselves. I am bound by the scriptures I have quoted, and my conscience is captive to the word of God. I cannot and will not retract anything, since it is neither safe nor right to go against conscience." This is in Latin, so he's using that word, conscientia here, right? The Archbishop of Trier, again famously, shouted at Luther, "Lay aside your conscience, Martin. You must lay it aside because it is in error." Now, this tells us something very important, right? Conscience is not just a thing that you can claim willy-nilly, right? It has to be related to some kind of law. Eventually, Kant, during the Enlightenment, would kind of marry conscience and personal choice and law and phronesis, right? We're not going to be able to get to that today, but this has a history after this sort of crucial moment in the Reformation, of course, right? But in essence, right, the Archbishop is saying, you are wrong. Your conscience is leading you down the garden path. It's leading you to hell. It's leading you to evil. And Luther is in some ways echoing Aquinas, right, when he says, it is not safe to go against conscience. And in the honest good faith of my reading of these authorities, right, my understanding of what I am commanded to do, right, there is an authority involved, but I cannot go against it no matter how many people tell me I'm wrong. Here's Thomas More's letter to Margaret Roper about his interaction with the lords at Lambeth. More says, "Then said my lord of Westminster to me, that howsoever the matter seemed unto mine own mind, I had cause to fear that mine own mind was erroneous." Just like the Bishop of Trier, right? Your conscience could be wrong, right? "When I see the great council of the realm determine of my mind the contrary, and that therefore I ought to change my conscience. To that I answered, that if there were no more but myself upon my side, and the whole Parliament upon the other, I would be sore afraid to lean to mine own mind, only against so many. But on the other side, if it so be that in some things for which I refuse the oath, I have, as I think I have, upon my part as great a counsel and a greater too, I am not then bounden to change my conscience and confirm it to the council of one realm against the general council of Christendom." So note the similarities and note the differences here, right? They sound very similar, right? It's not safe for me to just change my conscience because some earthly authority tells me to. Through my conscience, I have a link to a higher power and a higher law. Now, the crucial difference between Luther and More is how they conceive of that higher law and where the authority comes from. Luther says the authority comes from the word, the scripture, and from reason, which would of course become a crucially important guiding light of the Reformation and of the Enlightenment, right? More says that he has Christendom on his side, that is the communion of saints. So they're looking to different sources of authority. That's the difference between them, but not, right, this insistence upon the right of conscience to link to that authority, even when worldly powers go against you, even when you are told again and again to change your mind because you're wrong. And the possibility that you may be wrong is baked in, right? We've been puzzling throughout this series of episodes, the last 5 episodes, maybe we've been puzzling over this thing, right? Why does God allow bad things to happen? Well, here's one answer, right? It's because he prefers freedom and chaos to slavery and servile devotion. The ability of More and Luther to make their decision on the basis of their conscience in good faith, no matter who told them otherwise, right? That in and of itself has inherent value, even if they make the wrong decision, right? Conscience in itself has value because it is the mechanism whereby we exercise our choice, we seek virtue, we seek the good, we work our way back to God. All of that having been said, right, there would be excesses of this too, right? Rousseau in Emile is kind of famous. Emile is 1762, Rousseau's sort of book about education, or his sort of reflections on education, is famous for kind of making conscience almost supreme over everything, right? And saying that, you almost don't need, in Rousseau, you don't need an authority. He says, reason alone teaches us to know good and evil. Therefore, conscience, which makes us love one and hate the other, though it is independent of reason, cannot develop without it. Before the age of reason, we do good or ill without knowing it, and there is no morality in our actions, although there is sometimes in our feeling with regard to other people's actions in relation to ourselves. A child wants to overturn everything he sees. If this were the place for it, I would try to show how the first impulses of the heart give rise to the stirrings of conscience, and how from the feelings of love and hatred spring the first notions of good and evil. I would show that justice and kindness are no mere abstract terms, no mere moral conceptions framed by the understanding, but true affections of the heart, enlightened by reason, the natural outcome of our primitive affections, that by reason alone, unaided by conscience, we cannot establish any natural law, and that all natural right is a vain dream if it does not rest upon some instinctive need of the human heart. Now, there's a lot in here, of course, that based on what I've just said, I agree with, right? That we do have this instinctive power within us, this inborn habit, right? The crucial difference here in Rousseau is that I don't think he puts enough emphasis on like what that inborn habit is connecting you to, right? Remember that both Luther and More thought their conscience was giving them access to some absolute truth beyond what the corrupt world was telling them. Rousseau also thinks your conscience can stand you in good stead against the corrupt world, but it basically all comes from within you, right? So obviously everything has its excesses, and conscience is not the only thing, right, that to consider and to take into account when you're making your choices. Some things, right, you can't just the law can't just allow you to punch people in the face and so on and so forth. We know all of these things. However, your conscience is a way of accessing an authority. And the question for you is, what is that authority? It's not President Biden, right? Because President Biden is a man and he's going to die one day, right? We're all going to die one day. It's not even, right, the American regime, which will fall one day, right? What is your authority? For Luther, it was the word of God. For More, it was the whole company of heaven. For all Christians, in some way, it must ultimately be God. And then however you believe that God communicates to humankind and to the mass of tradition and wisdom that goes before you, right? But what is the authority that you are seeking? That is the first orienting question that you have a right to ask whenever somebody makes some grand edict about what you have to do because of the calculations that he has made about climate change or coronavirus or whatever, right? They are not your authority. What is your authority? Where does it come from, and how does it come to you from God? And how does your conscience lead you to that? And how can you insist upon your right to act on that conscience? Because otherwise, there's no point to the moral life at all. All right, let's answer a mailbag question using some of these tools. Okay, here's a mailbag question from Falderal. Sounds like my office is implementing vaccine mandates come next week. I have tested positive for the antibodies twice, so I was probably asymptomatic, but had it before last February. However, natural immunity and medical exemptions will not be considered. I know if I want to avoid the crap coming down the pipe, I should look for a job at a smaller company. But should I try to stay and not comply with the mandate before I get fired? Well, now I need to ask you, right, what the authority is for you in your life to which your conscience might appeal, and what are the priorities that that authority enjoins upon you. I would suggest, right, that perhaps some of them at least are honesty, care for your family. If you have dependents, I imagine you might, right? Your wife and children or anyone else, right? You have a responsibility to them. And then citizenship, patriotism, right? What is your role in this moment of crisis that we are up against in this country? And all of those things, right, can legitimately, I believe, be derived from scripture, right? And your conscience's job is to perform that act of prudence, of weighing those things against one another. I can tell you what I think I would do in your situation. And then you can tell me later on Locals what you decide to do, because once again, it is your right to make this choice, right? At this point, I don't think conservatives are served by quitting jobs that have vaccine mandates. I think we do the best for our country if we stay as long as we can and make them fire us, because the more people experience in their daily lives the reality of human beings whom they know, who are not insane, who they may respect and like, right, and who stand up and say no, the more the hold of authoritarianism is broken, right? Anytime, even if you see somebody who's not wearing a mask, right, suddenly you think, oh, well, maybe everybody doesn't have to do this, right? Maybe we can rebel. There was this woman on the subway in New York who tore down these obscene posters from OkCupid, I think it was. It was one of the dating apps. And everybody saw that video and it was like, oh, right, like she's doing the thing like a lot of us kind of want to do. Like maybe we should do that, you know? So there is an immense power, an immense witness just in occupying that space, to use a kind of like lefty term, right? And forcing them into these uncomfortable conversations. Now, it may not be very fun for you to do that. And so you have to consider that. You have to consider the toll it might take on you emotionally. But you also don't know where it could go, right? You might find that, in fact, your boss is having similar questions and reservations, or other people at your office, right? So I think that if you absent yourself, you deprive yourself of your opportunity to fight back. You've actually been given, in some way, by God, an opportunity to fight back. Now, don't lie. Right? This is another one of those priorities that I suggested, right? Might come to you from your authority. And you might have a natural intuitive grasp that not lying is a good thing. The vaccine mandate people aren't worth compromising your integrity in that way, right? And ultimately, as you say, you're probably going to have to go somewhere else. The likelihood is, right, that if you want to avoid this, you are, if these people are really serious about this, then they will fire you, right? So don't lie to them. Maintain your dignity and maintain your integrity. And at the same time, look for another job, because you also have a responsibility to support yourself and whoever depends upon you, right? There's a practical example of how 3 different priorities given to you by your conscience, through your conscience, from your authority, right? From the authority of the moral law, from the authority of scripture, right? Those 3 priorities can be balanced against one another. Stick around, don't quit, fight your fight, but look for another job. Let me know, Felderall, if that's helpful. Let me know what you decide to do. God bless you and shepherd you on your way, because the other thing is that he is real and he will fight for you and pull strings for you. Okay, if you want to ask mailbag questions like that and have them answered on the show or during live streams, you got to be a Locals VIP. If you're not a Locals VIP, man, you are missing out on episodes that come a week in advance, on episodes without ads, on exclusive essays, and on getting your questions answered like this. So go to youngheretics.com/locals and come join this incredible group of folks that is taking the principles of the West into their real lives and talking together about how to do that. God bless. Stay strong. That's it for me this week. If you like what you hear, you will love the work that I do at the Claremont Institute, where we talk a lot about prudence, actually, and its role in the American regime, because we are an institute for the recovery of the American idea. We put out 2 publications, the Claremont Review of Books and The American Mind. Both of them, in my humble opinion, are excellent, and not just because I write in them. There are also many other smarter people than me who write there. If you want to support our work, you can go to claremont.org/donate. And now is a really great time to do that. I really believe in what we're doing. If you do, then mention in the notes that you heard about Claremont through Young Heretics, because that's always really nice to see. Thank you, as always, for being here with me. It's such a joy. I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.